Well, good morning and welcome back. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, Valley Beth Shalom, Torah study for a Shabbos morning, joined by my dear friend Rabbi Marc Gellman from South Florida and late of New York, where he spent the high holidays. Marc, welcome home.
Good
Welcome
to be
back.
back. I missed you.
Missed you too. And we missed all of you who spent time with us. I'm sorry that we weren't with you over the holidays, but you can imagine how trying these holidays are for folks that do what we do. But we're delighted to be back with you for another whole year, God willing, of Torah study. And for those who do live in the LA area, on Wednesday night, October 18th, Rabbi Gellman, who is going to come out to LA to see his family, will be joining me at Valley Beth Shalom at 7:30
That'll
for
be fun.
We'll be doing Torah study live, and you're all welcome to join us. Our topic that night will be, does the soul survive? Rabbi Gellman is an advocate, and we'll talk some today as well about bringing back the idea of afterlife into Jewish religious thought. I'm not going to oppose him, but of course, I always have good questions for him.
However,
right. Anyway, it's wonderful to be back, Marc. Shabbat Shalom and Shana Tova. I hope it's a really sweet and pleasant new year for us all. This morning, we are beginning the holiday of Sukkot. Again, it's a problem of calendaring that they stuck this amazingly wonderful celebration of the fall harvest right after the high holidays.
Yeah, when no one wants to come back to shul.
When no one feels like
sooled out.
Except for one thing, except for this holiday, Sukkot is the diametric opposite of Yom Kippur.
Yes.
Yom Kippur, we have no bodies. We are angels. There's no time, there's no eating, there's no pleasure, there's just the soul and its self-examination and scrubbing clean of all of the pollution. On Sukkot, we come back to our bodies and we go outside where the breeze is beautiful and we sit in a sukkah with a thatched roof and we feel the sun on our faces or a little bit of rain if necessary, and we feast. And we enjoy, again, the full life of the body. And that becomes the holiday of Sukkot. It is, in Jewish tradition, Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy. The historical referent, which is very weak, by the way, is the idea that we lived in Sukkot as we traveled the Sinai Desert.
We didn't.
Even the Talmud says.
We didn't live in booths. We lived in tents.
Even the Talmud says so. So, Rabbi Kiva says it was clouds overhead. So the sukkah reminds us of the clouds. But the agricultural idea was the farmer would go out with his workers and they would live in the sukkah, in the booth out in the fields while harvesting the crops to get them in before the winter rains. But it is a time to enjoy nature. It is a time to return to our bodies. It is a time to enjoy the fullness of being a human being. And it is a holiday of gratitude. It is really the holiday upon which the American festival of Thanksgiving was based. There is an interesting tradition among the many traditions of Sukkot, besides sitting in the sukkah, besides waving the lulav and the etrog, the four species of vegetation that are deemed sacred symbols this time of year. There is this wonderful custom of reading a book. Every major Jewish holiday has a book attached to it. The book of Esther, of course, is the book that we read for Purim, and the book of Lamentation on Tisha B'Av, the book of Ruth on Shavuot. This holiday, we read Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, which is one of the most interesting, deep, troubling, disturbing, philosophically challenging books of the entire corpus of the Tanakh. So let's open that book together and take a look and see what it says. And we're going to ask three fundamental questions. Basically, what's the point of this book? How did it end up in the Bible? And why is it read on Sukkot? The book opens with a section that's very familiar to anyone who is literate in biblical tradition. It opens with the notion of vanity. So I'm going to put it up on the screen. I hope you can see it. Well, not there, but up here. The way of the world. The words of Kohelet. Now, the name Kohelet comes from the word kahal, meaning a gatherer, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Now, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, was Solomon. Why he identifies as Solomon, we'll find out in a moment. Utter futility. Hevel hevalim. It begins in Hebrew. Utter futility. Hevel refers to a weather condition that's very familiar here in Southern California. It's our weather condition about 9 months of the year. Early morning, low clouds and fog burning off by noon. Hevel means mist, means fog. It means that which is gone within a few hours of sunshine. It has no substance. It doesn't last. It's not permanent. This is a book which reflects upon impermanence. Utter futility, all is futile. It's Hevel. What real value is there for man in all that he gains under the sun? One generation comes, another goes. The earth remains the same forever. The sun sets, the sun rises, the sunset glides back where it was, southward blowing, turning northward, ever turning, blows the wind. All streams flow into the sea. The sea is never full. They flow back to where they came from again. And then he says, only that which has happened, only that shall happen which has happened. Only that occurred which has occurred. There's nothing new under the sun. And then he switches from poetry into prose. Sometimes there's something which they say, hey, look, this one's new. Nope. It occurred long ago in ages that went before. The early ones are not remembered. So too that will occur later will be no more than remembered than those occur at the very end. This is the overture of the book. And it's familiar if you ever studied existentialism in college. Usually we got to it in second year of sophomore year of philosophy classes when,
Right.
you're 19, 20 years old and beginning that journey of being a cynical young adult. And you read Soren Kierkegaard and this notion of, death is going to come and wipe away all value in human life. And therefore, what meaning is there in human life? That's how the book begins. Marc, how did this book get into the Bible?
I have no idea. And it's just bewildering to me because here you have an Epicurean tome. It's the only purpose of life is to seize whatever pleasure you can, because in the end, death is the worms are gonna eat you up, and there's nothing else. And so get whatever pleasures you can get, and that's the only thing you can do. Now, I think the reason it's in there is because the very premise of Yom Kippur, and actually the whole Days of Awe, the whole thing, is that there is an accounting. All right, there's an accounting, there's a book of life. And the question comes up to any reasonable thinker, what if that's not true? What if it is not true that there's a book of life and that there's an accounting? And so the question comes up, what is the reason to do good? On one level, the Days of Awe level, the reason to do good is to protect yourself against dying, against not being written in the book of life. Okay. But what if that isn't the case? What if there is no book and there is no writing? As Elisha ben Abuya, the great teacher of Rabbi Meir, who became an Epicurus, a denier of Judaism, an atheist, a follower of Greek philosophy, says, late Din, the late Dayan, there is no judge and there is no justice. So the rabbis who actually attached these books to the holidays and who had a different view about life after death, they had to deal with it. And they had to answer the question. And their answer is, well, there is an accounting, but it goes beyond death. And the accounting is finished not before you die, but after you die. So if you think that you're going to get away with all of the bad stuff you do in this life, you're wrong. Your soul is going to be punished in one way or another afterwards. So the first argument for life after death turns out to be the need for justice. to balance the scales of justice, which are not in proper equipoise during this life. They're sometimes and oftentimes askew, so that the righteous people are suffer, tov ralo rav bad person and good happens to him, a good person and bad happens to him. And the rabbis are acutely aware that this one question could bring down their whole theological structure. This one question. If there is no life after death, everything collapses. And the solution they needed, they finally received after the conquest of Alexander the Great in 131, beginning what we call the Hellenistic period, the period of great Greek influence throughout the Middle East, but particularly in Israel and Judea. And that was the Aristotelian, and it was also the Platonic idea, that the world is made up of two fundamental principles, matter and form. Matter is the principle of potentiality, form is the principle of actuality. And in the interaction of matter, which you could take as an example, clay is matter, and form is the idea of a sculptor to make out of that clay a statue, let's say, of a horse. And the form imposes itself in some way on the matter, and you get a horse sculpture. And Plato and Aristotle had a fight about that. How does this happen? Universalis in rem, universalis ante rem. There's a great picture called The School of Athens by Raphael, where you see the two of them, one's pointing up, one's going like this. But whatever it was, there was an interaction. This interaction produces everything we see. And the second Greek idea, in addition to matter and form, was that as you go up the spheres, there were 10 nested spheres, which was how people thought the cosmos looked until Copernicus. At the very highest level, there's no matter at all. It becomes less material. Instead of earth, air, fire, and water, which we see down here on Earth, you have a fifth essence, a quintessence called ether, from which we get the word ethereal. And at the very top, you have God, who is the unmoved mover, thought thinking itself, according to Aristotle, which meant there is no material essence at all up there. Well, so what this means to the rabbis is that this sounds good to us, because we can take matter and form and give it a Jewish twist by saying matter is guf, your body, neshama, a new word that they invented, not nefesh, which is the biblical word for what we mistranslate as soul. It really means just life, but neshama and guf. So your neshama, your soul, a true soul, only formal essence, some kind of inheritance from God, like a piece of God, is connected to your body at birth, and it lives its life in some kind of dialectic with your body, your material body, and then when you die, it separates out. Then there's another debate, does it get put into new bodies or not? And the Mekubalim have their own view about that. Don't want to confuse our students here, but basically that's what happened. That's what makes Rabbinic Judaism different from biblical Judaism. That's their big change. That's what starts Judaism as we know it. It's the whole ball of wax.
So come back to Ecclesiastes for a second.
So
Kohelet, or
Ecclesiastes, the last gasp of there is no life after death. So what's their answer? His answer is, look.
Well, we'll get to his answer. Hang on, we'll get to his answer in a minute. Let's first. So what you're suggesting then is that this is the last of sort of pre-rabbinic Judaism.
That's what I'm saying.
Judaism before it met Aristotle and before it solved this problem. So it's the best expression of the problem that the rabbis are going to come and answer with the notion of afterlife.
And the answer comes in two books, which are not part of the Tanakh, but are part of the intertestamental literature, called the Book of Enoch and the Wisdom of Solomon. And it's also confirmed by the writings of Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian, who records that this actually happened at that time. And that is life after death.
All right, so let's come back for a second. So here's Kohelet's problem.
Yeah.
Kohelet's problem is he's looking out into the world, and he notices, of course, what all of us know, which is that human life it comes to an end. And he asks, what's of value given that brutal fact, that hard, harsh fact of death? And he does sort of a mathematical equation, which is X, which is any pursuit, anything that we identify as important to us in life, minus death equals what? Is there anything that I can invest myself in, that I can devote myself to, that will get me past death, that will give me some positive integer, as it were, some positive result minus death? And here he's going to do a series of experiments. And here's why it's important. Now, in the ancient world, you could write a book and claim to be somebody. In modernity, that'll get you arrested. But in ancient times, you were allowed to do it. And he puts himself out as the king in Jerusalem, son of David, which we know as Solomon, right? And the reason why is because Solomon had two characteristics. Number one, he was the richest of all people. And number two, he was the wisest of all people. And you had to have both, because you could say, well, Bill Gates, he can buy immortality. Me, I can't afford it. That's why Solomon had to be the richest. And the wisest is he had to be able to see through all of these experiments. So really quickly, I'll go over the book really quickly with you, because I've re-edited it for you. Chutzpah, huh? So he says, I'm going to look and see. Sorry?
Kohelet according to Feinstein.
Yeah, well, I set my mind to study and probe with wisdom all that happens under the sun. I want to see what people devote themselves. And he's going to do 4 principal experiments about the 4 things that are most common in what people devote themselves to, right? The first is pleasure, right? So who doesn't like a little fun? So he says, come, I'll treat you to mirth, in merriment, taste mirth. He says, I found that was futile. And then he says, I tempted my flesh with wine and grasped with folly, letting my mind direct with wisdom, that I might find out what's better for people to do. And then he gives you a long list of all the amazing things he happened. And it ends with this wonderful thing: I withheld from my eyes nothing they asked for. That's like the American consumer dream, right? And that I found what? That I got enjoyment, but that's all I got. So pleasure is fun, is joyful for the moment you're enjoying it. But the moment it passes, it doesn't leave you anything. It doesn't get you past death, that's for sure. And it's good for the moment, but it doesn't have any lasting value. And more than that, of course, the problem with pleasure is that the first time you do something, it's amazing. The second time you do the same thing, it's less amazing, because you don't have the element of surprise you had the first time. The first time you eat in a new restaurant, it's unbelievable. The second time you bring friends, it's never as good, because now you don't have the surprise you had the first time. So he says, okay, how about wealth? And he said, the problem with wealth, of course, is that when I die, I'm going to have to pass it on to my good-for-nothing kids. And what good is that, right? It's going to be spent by those who didn't make it, and they're not going to appreciate it. So wealth doesn't get me past death. And the third one, now he's going to get to some more spiritual things, and this is where it becomes controversial in terms of Judaism. How about wisdom? I mean, who values education more than Jews? But he said, in the end, the wise man and the fool die the same way. Wisdom is better than ignorance, because it'll help you make better choices in the course of your life. But it won't get you past death, because wisdom can't get you past death. The wisdom dies with the wise person. And finally, here's the most controversial, is righteousness, right? Goodness, doing holy things. And he says, you know what? The same fate is in store for all, for the righteous and the wicked.
There
For
it
the
is. That's
pure.
the key verse, 9:2.
There it is. For him who sacrifices and him who doesn't, for him who is pleasing, that is pleasing to God, and for him who is displeasing, for him who swears and keeps his promises and him who doesn't. The sad thing, as it goes on, the same fate is in store for all, right? And then he says, sometimes I've seen a good man perish in spite of his goodness, and a wicked man perish in spite of his wickedness. And then he and then he says something which is really remarkable, which you wouldn't imagine is in the Bible. He says, you know what? Don't overdo goodness. Don't overdo goodness. Don't act the wise to excess. Don't be evil, but don't overdo. Remember Fagin in Oliver Twist, right? You've got to pick a pocket or two. So what he does is he goes through these different experiments, trying to figure out what's worth pursuing in life. And as the rabbi pointed out, as he comes to the end, he says there's nothing. And therefore, it's not suicidal. It's not even depressive. He just says, let's accept life for what it is. And he has two answers. The one you'll recognize because Pete Seeger and the Byrds wrote it into a beautiful song. And the other, he is the prose version of the same thing, right? There's a season set for everything and a time for every experience under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, right? And a time for, so there's a rhythm to life. And the best that you can do is to follow the rhythm and know that there are going to be moments of joy and moments of sadness. And then finally, he gives you the prose version of it. Go eat your bread in gladness and drink your wine in joy. For your action was long ago approved by God. Let your clothes be washed, your head never lack ointment. Enjoy happiness with a woman that you love. It's directed at young men. All the fleeting days of your life. For that alone is what you get out of life. That was what you get out of life. So the book ends with a sort of, it's like the resigned wisdom of an old man who says, go and enjoy it because this is what life gives you. So Rabbi Gellman suggests that this is the last sort of gasp of a pre-rabbinic Judaism.
Yep.
And rabbinic Judaism's answer was, no, there is more, because this life isn't the only episode that we go through, and that judgment is real, and therefore there is something that survives death. That's one way to read the book. Did I get that right?
You got it totally right, except one thing that I would add, and that is Kohelet didn't know Kant and didn't know Ben Azai. And that would have basically given him another answer he didn't have, aside from the rabbinic answer that there's life after death. And that is Kant's notion in the categorical imperative and of his critique of practical reasoning, that basically the reason to do good is not because you get rewarded, but because it is a maxim that you would will to be a universal law of nature. That's Kant's obtuse way of saying, do good just because it's good. And Ben Azai had a simpler and more profound way of saying exactly the same thing. In Pirkei Avot, schar mitzvah mitzvah. The reward of a mitzvah is the mitzvah itself. And I can't tell you how often when I teach this in theology classes or to conversion classes, I say, really, why are you doing good deeds? If you're doing good deeds to get paid off, either here or in heaven even, it's not a motivation that's morally significant, because it's a transactional act. You're doing it to pay off God. It's the bubblegum God. You put a quarter in the machine, you get a piece of bubblegum. The quarter is a good deed. The bubblegum is some benefit either on this life or the next. But if you do something that's good just because it is good, well, then you're freed from any of the issues of whether you get rewarded or not. You don't care if you get rewarded, because you aren't doing it to get rewarded. And that's the alternative that, by the way, Job did not have that, and Kohelet did not have that. Mm-hmm. But once you open that up, And I think that's the place you and I will eventually find our point of common agreement, whether you believe in life after death or not. And that is, look, can we not agree that the best way to live your life is not to do good deeds to get paid off, but to do good deeds because they're good deeds?
Hmm. So let me suggest a slightly different way of looking at Kohelet. And when I've taught this to people like you have, so I ask them this questions. Before we get, before we critique Kohelet, suppose I ask you the same question. What do you live for?
Yeah.
What's the deepest motivation of the things you do? What gives you a sense of satisfaction in your life? And most people answer differently than Kohelet. Most people say, well, I have a close relationship with family. I have my kids, grandkids. I have a group of friends that are. So what most people will answer is something that Kohelet never mentions. So I go back and I look at Kohelet. One of the interesting characteristics of Kohelet is he's in this alone. There's no social context.
Very
There's
nice.
nobody around him. So he says, I want to go figure out what's worth living. So now let's just really quickly take his four experiments and run them again, but this time run them in a social context. Pleasure. Yeah, if you're just going to a restaurant by yourself, that's gonna get boring really quickly, even if you live in a great city with great restaurants. The joy of going to a restaurant, the joy of pleasure is not just to enjoy the pleasure, it's to share it, right? Disneyland can be a trying afternoon. Disneyland with a little kid is a joy. I mean, until the kid gets tired. But you go to see Disneyland through the eyes of a 5-year-old, it's a whole different experience.
Totally right.
Same thing with wealth, right? Wealth by itself is a kind of a sad pursuit. Wealth, however, in a social context can do a lot of good. You
Yeah.
you can do things with wealth that change the world by investing in projects that change the world about you and get a tremendous satisfaction out of it. Wisdom and righteousness. Let's jump to righteousness for a minute. The line that I find astonishing is he says, in my experience, I've seen alongside goodness is wickedness, alongside justice is injustice, and I concluded that all is futile. Well, the question is, if you saw injustice, why didn't you do something about it? He doesn't feel claimed by the injustice and the wickedness that he sees in the world. He doesn't see it his responsibility to respond because he doesn't see himself as living in any sort of social context. But most of us see someone in need, we rush to help. It's even an instinctual thing, a guy is stuck on a freeway. Somebody stops and helps him change a tire. I mean, there's an instinctual response to human suffering, to human need. And the last one, which I think is the most ironic of all, which is the fun thing, is wisdom, right? And here I think this is where Rabbi Gellman is exactly right, where the rabbinic tradition jumps off of this. Wisdom, he says, having wisdom doesn't get you past death. Yeah, but teaching wisdom does, right? If you have wisdom, holding it doesn't do anything good. Sharing it does, right? We have a word for teaching wisdom in Jewish life. It's called Torah. And it's what we do here. And we share wisdom. And that's the way you gain immortality in Jewish life. And here's the great irony. The great irony, Marc, is that a guy who said there's nothing new under the sun and there's nothing you can do in the world to survive death, we're reading his book 3,500 years later, right? Or not 2,500 years later. We're reading his book. We're reading. So despite himself, he earned his immortality. I mean, frankly, if you really believe that nothing can ever change, why'd you bother writing a book? You write a book because you think you can change someone's life. So I think one of the answers, you're exactly correct, by the way. This is the last expression of a Judaism without a sense of afterlife. Without a sense of afterlife.
Yeah.
And it's the last expression of a Judaism, or it's not the last expression, frankly, it should have been, but it's probably the most articulate expression of a kind of instrumentalist idea of Judaism, doing a mitzvah for the reward it might earn me. And you're exactly right. In both cases, the rabbis corrected that and changed it. But I think one more thing is that the rabbis took very seriously the idea of lo tov heyot adam levado. You can't live by yourself. That's not the way human life is meant to be lived. And so by providing a social context of family, of community, and my response to humanity, it changes all of Kohelet all over. It changes all of Kohelet, the whole way we read it.
Yeah, that's
All right, so
beautiful.
let's answer our three questions. So how did this get into the Bible? I mean, the Bible, my God, he says, don't be too righteous. Several chapters earlier, we read Kadoshim Tihiyu Ki Kadoshani. You shall be holy because I God am holy.
Well,
Who let
let's start
this
with
into
the
the
first
Tanakh?
thing. Well, how did it get in? It got in for a very, very big reason,
Yeah.
which only Jewish theologians, which we've produced about 4 of them over 3,000 years, only they understand, which is this. The Tanakh is not a philosophical book, but it's dealing with philosophical issues. Mm-hmm. And that is its fundamental contradiction. It is a pre-philosophical work. We talk about what you just said, 3,000 years ago, 4,000, the Abrahamic period could be 1800 before the Common Era, or 2000 before. We're talking 4,000 years here. And the Greek, the time of the emergence of philosophy is only 500 years before zero. So we've got at least 3,500 years before philosophy is even invented by Aristotle. So the problem with the Bible is that it's about philosophical issues, but it doesn't have the language to talk about it. So after all of the high holidays, the rabbis say, look, we do owe something to smart Jews and to thinking Jews, not just to Jews who daven, not just who, many of whom also think, but not just to Jews who pray and follow the mitzvahs. We want to address Jews who are thinking about the largest issues of the purpose of life, which we now understand as in the growth of Christianity. They're thinking about this stuff. They're thinking about it. They're talking about it. And we need to do that too. So they're thinking about this stuff for the first time. And after Yom Kippur is the right time. Okay, we've gotten all the mitzvahs done. Now let's think about the big issues. We've cleansed ourselves. But now what is the purpose of all this? What's the purpose of life? And I think that's why it's in. I would add only one other point, and that's just my contrarian nature. And that is, when I teach it, one of the things I do sometimes is I say, okay, I'm going to defend Kohelet. I'm going to defend his view of life. And the way I defend it is I say, not his view, but here's my critique of Kohelet. Everything he says is wrong. And it's demonstrably proven to be wrong. And first reason is what you said, it lacks a social context, which is a brilliant point. And the second is the point I would bring, which is take a look at people who actually do good. And you tell me whether their lives are demonstrably worse than people who spend every day cheating people. I will defend the notion that the thieves and killers and scum of the earth who fill our world have worse lives. I will defend that idea. And that the people who live lives of gratitude and kindness have a better life. And that it isn't true that we all have the same fate. It is absolutely not true. Shem tov kishem tov. If you have a good reputation, that's everything. And if you have a bad reputation, that's everything too. And people who have a bad reputation live miserable lives. And I think that point can be defended. He takes it as an absolute, obvious point. that the world is unjust and that good people suffer and wicked people thrive. Well, hello. I don't think that that's true. And if you look at the happiest people you know, they're people who have devoted their lives to good deeds and good works. And if you look at the most miserable people you know, these are people who have tried to game the system their whole life and try to get an edge on everybody else, do unto others before they do it unto you. They think in that snarky version of the golden rule, they can live a life. Well, they can't live a life. You can't live a good life like that. And it has nothing to do with heaven. It has nothing to do with what happens after you die. It has to do with the quality of your life right here and right now. And so that's the other point I would make. A good defense can be made that righteous people do have a better quality of life than wicked people.
Wonderful. So I'll just add one. I want to emphasize one thing that you said, which I think is very, very important. We tend, when we think about Jewish life, to identify Jewish life, first of all, with things we do, the mitzvot, living in a sukkah, keeping kosher, giving tzedakah, right? And sometimes that overwhelms the deep questions of life. And we forget that this is a faith which has asked the deep questions of the purposes of life. And what Kohelet reminds us of is, as you said, is that these questions of the deep purpose of life are really the deepest reason for a Jewish life. And I think that's very, very important, very, very important as we begin the year. As we begin the year and begin reading Torah all over again in Genesis, we're going to be asking these very deep questions about what is the nature of human being, what is the nature of gender, what is the nature of sexuality, what is the nature of work, what is the nature of good and evil. The deep philosophical questions aren't just to be passed over in favor of the, do this. Or worse, aren't to be passed over in favor of an exclusive emphasis on ethnic politics, pro-Israel, anti-Israel. There are deep, deep questions of right and wrong, good and evil, the purpose of human life, embedded in this faith, embedded in this tradition. And the book asks us these questions.
Yeah,
and then
I would ask our students, our listeners, and many of them who are our listeners are actually our teachers. I would ask you this one question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to live a reflective Jewish life? This is a simpler question. Do you want to live a Jewish life? And what does that mean? But do you really want to live, don't you want to live a reflective Jewish life? Mm-hmm. One in which you're not afraid to ask big questions, in which you ask of your faith some response to the universal mysteries of human finitude and existence. Mm-hmm. I want to live a reflective Jewish life. I want to live a life with a faith that is not afraid to engage me in the largest and most important questions I ask. Now, I recognize that my interest and your interest in deep philosophical questions about the meaning of life is not everybody's main concern when they wake up in the morning. I get that. A natural intellectual is a rare kind of orchid, but it is an orchid, and it is beautiful, and its scent goes out to the world. And that's how I see us, you and I. We are orchids, and we have been able to bloom because of the uniqueness of Jewish life. Christianity had orchids too, and they founded them and created orchids by having monasteries and by having communities where people thought and wrote. They produced an Augustine, we produced a Rambam, but they produced all these thinkers, and it's to their credit that they did that. And it is a sadness that Judaism did not produce more deep thinkers.
Or thinkers within the tradition. We produce deep thinkers.
Yes.
We have a Freud and a Marx and an Einstein. I mean, they found their natural setting outside of the faith, outside of the community. The last question is, so you've answered the question of how this got into the Bible. The last question has to do with how this got to be read on Sukkot. And I would suggest simply two ways of reading it. First of all, that his advice is really interesting. He says, because you're not going to get anything else out of life, get everything out of life you can. Go enjoy the gifts of life. And that certainly is the philosophy of Sukkot. Like, for God's sakes, get outside, sit at a table, have a feast, be with friends, drink some good wine, and enjoy the gifts that God has given you in life. But here's the other part of it, which is something that you said so very articulately. Don't forget that this isn't the whole thing. Because if you say, as the Epicureans did, that that's all you get out of life, as Kohelet does, then you're going to end up right back at the beginning of the book with utter futility, right? That's why I think, at the very end of the book, there's a postscript. Every scholar tells you that postscript was not there originally. It was
I
added
believe
later.
that. They
Yeah,
added it at the end.
yes, but I think I know why they added it. I mean, let me show you the postscript,
Yeah,
just so everybody knows.
put that up there.
The postscript says, and so the sum of the matter is, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments. For this applies to all mankind, that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. In many ways, Marc, that's your point, that if this book is the last expression of pre-rabbinic Judaism without a sense of accountability, without a sense of afterlife, that postscript says, to be continued is really what it says. I think that the postscript does grasp something very powerful, which is, look, if you say that Kohelet's right, and all you have in life are the pleasures of the daily moment, and there's nothing wrong with enjoying the pleasures of the moment, you should enjoy them, and you should enjoy them fully and with all your might. Don't hold back. But don't think that's all there is. There is a great sense of responsibility. There is a sense of goodness. There is a sense of sharing wisdom. There's a lot more to life than just this. So today, go enjoy the wonderful gifts of life. And tomorrow morning, get up and finish the job of Tikkun Olam. Thank you for sharing, Yontif. Thank you for sharing this morning,
Hag
Marc.
Sameach.
Many blessings. We'll see you all next week for Simchas Torah. Hag
Yay.
Sameach.